Hello everybody, it's Michael Hollands once again for Sound of the Movies. Today I have the pleasure to be joined by Austin Wintory. On today's episode, we will focus on his career as a composer for films and video games. And of course, we will talk extensively about his latest albums, Remnants, as well as Erica. Welcome, Austin.
Well, hello. Thanks for having me here.
Thank you for joining me. It's a pleasure. Austin, at first I would like to know which composers in general served as the main inspiration for you personally.
Well, there's a few, but easily the most influential was Jerry Goldsmith. Jerry's music came into my life when I was around 10, and I never had any concept of a composer before that, not even a classical composer or anything. Just wasn't in my mind. And when I heard his writing and how colorful it is and adventurous and creative, it just was one of those light bulbs. Immediately, I knew this is what I wanted to do, what I wanted to learn everything about, and all of that. But more than that, it's not like my goal was ever to write music that sounds like Goldsmith. He had this way of writing where it always sounded fresh and it always sounded as though he was learning it for the first time. In other words, if a career like his, how many love scenes or car chases did he score? Probably hundreds. And it would be really easy to just kind of phone it in and say, yeah, I've done one car chase. They're all the same. And, every car chase just kind of more or less do the same thing. And he never did that. I just can't think of any other composer to that extreme that's true for. Um, so that philosophy of trying to kind of reinvent yourself basically with every note, every chord, every melody, never mind every cue or every score. That was what I actively wanted to try and embody. I wanted to be like him in that way. There's an enormous number of composers that I love across the spectrum, from the classical side to the sort of the record world, and of course other composers.
Jerry Goldsmith is always a great choice. I mean, he serves as an inspiration for so many composers of any generation, and he certainly it has been one of the most influential ones. And you had been introduced to him, if I'm not mistaken, by your teacher back then. Could you tell me about this encounter and what you actually learned from him? How did that come about?
What? Yeah, sure. It was my childhood piano teacher. I just basically, it's simple that I didn't really know what to learn. I was going to study and take piano lessons, and so the question of what do you want to learn left me a bit blank. And my teacher said, "Well, tell you what." And he showed up the next week with a stack of vinyl records, and they were all Jerry Goldsmith and scores like Patch of Blue, and I was just transformed immediately. So it really just was him trying to think of a useful suggestion of music that I would be interested in learning to play.
And Austin, by this point, you have written music for many video games and also films, of course. But when did you first become enchanted with the gaming world? Could you tell me a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been a gamer. My memories of playing games go back even before my memories of anything to do with music. So I was playing games and going to the local arcade and things like that, from age 6, 7, something like that, and onward. So yeah, I've had essentially a controller in my hands for most of my whole life, and I wasn't initially trying to break into the game industry because I didn't know that much about it, and what little I knew about it, all the composers that I admired, they all were staff jobs, because in the early 90s, the idea of a freelance video game composer was basically non-existent. very very little of that concept, and so I didn't even consider it because I thought, well, I want to move to Los Angeles and I want to be like Jerry Goldsmith, James Horner, and Basil Polidorus, and you go job to job to job. You don't have a staff position somewhere, and so I felt even from a very early age that if I wanted to be a composer, but as luck would have it, and just the evolution of the world, right around the time I was in college and moved, which was about 2005, that seemed to be when the shift occurred. And so I was just kind of in the right place at the right time, and some opportunities emerged. And of course, I jumped on them immediately because I was in love with games. And if that was going to be an option, then oh my God, of course I'm going to take it.
Is there any game in particular that you played which made you say, I can see myself actually doing this? I can score a video game?
Oh, I, well, I don't know that it made me come to that conclusion, but it was one of the first that I remember um, absolutely captivating me because of its music, which was Grim Fandango. Just last year had its 20th anniversary, and that's this hybrid of kind of 1930s film noir with sort of a folkloric Mexican Day of the Dead. And the score was one of the first I remember ever hearing that was almost entirely recorded with live musicians. They were all live, and so I was used to that. And when I heard this game and it just burst with life and personality, it blew my mind, and it became very quickly one of my favorite games of all time, and one of my favorite game scores of all time also.
Great. And Austin, in 2012, if I'm not mistaken, you had written this outstanding score called Journey, which is very acclaimed. Did you ever expect to get such a tremendous feedback also from fans? How do you interact with fans that praise you for your work?
Definitely did not expect anything approaching the reaction that it got and still gets. I mean, I still to this day get tagged uh, all the time about Journey and even other Abzû. And so it was something that when it came time for the thing to come out, but I started on that project at the very beginning of 2009, and it came out in March of 2012. And by the time it came out, I felt like Journey represents what we are hoping. It represents our goal, our dream for this. But it is not necessarily a mainstream project. In other words, I thought if other people just don't get this, if they don't like it, or if it's not for them, I will hardly blame them because it's kind of unusual for video games. And I went into it with kind of low expectations, and so it was totally mind-blowing to me when it turned out to just explode and get this huge reaction and all this appreciation. And so yeah, I was not prepared. I don't know how one could be prepared. I still unprepared. It's been 7 years and I still don't know how to process it because it was just so lucky and so unusual. But then in terms of interacting with supporters or people that are nice to me online, it's no different than anybody else. If people send me a tweet or a message on Instagram, I want them to know I'm grateful and that I got that message and I heard it and I didn't dismiss it as anything other than as anything short of a very generous act on their part. We live in a world where there's so much content that if you come across something that you like, it's kind of like, okay, yeah, I found something I like, big deal. So for someone to hear something they like and then to actually go out of their way to write to the person that made it and make them know, hey, this matters to me, that's them taking a lot of time and energy for something they didn't have to do. And I'm just speechless every time that happens.
And Abzû is another great choice and a favorite of mine. and many people like it as well. Many fans, many journalists. A wonderful score. What do you remember of this project? What inspired you to write this massive and gorgeous piece of work?
Abzu was very much because of this absolutely beautiful and emotional game that Matt Nava and his team at Giant Squid were doing. And I was just trying to find a way to capture what they were doing through music. I hate to give a boring answer, but that's all that it is I just look at their work and say, how can I do justice to this? And how can I make sure that the music isn't, the obvious weakness in this project? Some people kind of called it like, Journey to the Underwater Edition or whatever. And, that wasn't really intentional, but I totally get why it feels that way. And it's not a shock. And so I wanted to make sure that the music didn't really actively feel like Journey. I didn't want to open up, a direct comparison too easily like that. So part of the inspiration was, Abzu itself, but then making sure that it was its own sound, its own vibe relative to Journey. Other than that, I don't know. It's every cue has kind of its own story, but that was kind of the overall idea.
Is there any specific type or genre of game, if you will, which you find most difficult to score?
Extremely systematized games are a little trickier because the music ends up becoming almost like a shopping list of the game states. I'm trying to explain this. That doesn't sound too technical, but in a manner of words, like for example, I did a game called Monaco. This was my first really learning the challenge of a heavily systematized score, because Monaco, the game has, a handful of basic modes that the player will go through. You have these modes, sneaking mode and the chase mode, and then when you finally get the kind of treasure that you're looking for, there's also this kind of escape mode. And so every level of the game, even though it's different level designs, and some of them are big and some are small, and they all have those same basic modes. So it became a big challenge to not make the music boring where every single track sounded the same, because they all had the same exact technical demands. And that's actually not uncommon in games, and it's totally not dependent on the genre. It's just a typical, because games they're unlike movies, they're very driven by systems. What are the game mechanics? What's the nature of the interaction that the player has with the game or with other players, that kind of thing. And since that so often influences on a technical level how you're implementing the music, it can lead to scores that are very kind of boring and flat and stagnant, because you're just going back and forth, stealth music and now combat music. That for me is always a challenge. I like things to ebb and flow more like a story, and so I'm always trying to find ways to kind of help create that feeling of movement and that feeling of storytelling in some way or another. And it can be very hard.
Austin, now I would love to talk a bit about Remnants. The album features music which was rejected, and it contains many very good cues, by the way. And at what point did you decide to release this album, which I was very happy about and pleased, because it's always interesting to hear music which had been written but rejected by some reason. Could you tell me a bit about that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So, scored a lot of, especially movies, where I never released a soundtrack album. And so a couple of years ago, I started thinking about the fact that I had a kind of back catalog of unreleased material, and started thinking about the idea of a kind of releasing some kind of, best of taking the best 2 or 3 cues from any number of projects and making a kind of giant compilation album, or multiple volumes even. I mean, I could easily do probably 10 albums worth, just because there's so many scores that I never released for, lots of independent films and things like that. And then it dawned on me as I was starting to plan that I also had I had a bunch of music that I'd written for mostly demos and pitches to get hired for things, where for whatever reason, they decided to go another direction, and I ended up not getting the job. And as I started to kind of gather those into one place, I realized I've got a ton of music, and so then I put the kind of greatest hits compilation on hold and started to focus on just because I figured people would find it more interesting, because one of the pieces on Remnants is supposed to be in the trash. And so that's kind of where it began. And it took a couple months because I had way more needed. There was well over 3 hours, almost 4 hours, I think, of music that I had eligible. And I wanted to make sure that what I released was, kind of whittled down to the best of that.
It's always hard to figure out why a cue gets rejected. I mean, when I listened to the album, there was quite a few pieces on there when I said to myself, it's hard to believe anybody wouldn't like that cue, or it's hard to believe anybody would even reject it. So, but it's a difficult process dealing with producers and filmmakers and directors. And what do producers or directors usually tell you when they don't like a cue? Is it like, well, we're not going to use it, or can you kind of tweak this or tweak that? How do you deal with criticism, or how do they express it?
Well, it depends. There's sort of two different answers to that, because these cues, most of those were pitches to get hired to write a score, and I was writing a demo to showcase my ideas. And then they were just not interested in that approach, and they wanted to take a different approach with the score. The overwhelming majority, I got zero feedback. It was they don't tell you, change this, change that. They say, no thanks. We found somebody else. And so I will never know, other than when the finished product finally is released and I hear the score that they did go with, I can then usually guess why they chose what they did. And often it's just because they were looking for something very different. They were looking for, in some cases I've pitched, a big orchestral approach, and then they wanted like intimate jazz or something just super different from what I had in mind. And that happens. And unless they tell you, it can be a kind of a guessing game. But in terms of when you're actually on a project and you get feedback, that sometimes can be quite intense, or or direct, and maybe not insulting, but it can be sometimes a little, make you feel a little funny. That's just the nature of the job. It is their job as a director and producer to be honest and direct, and to tell you exactly what they like and don't like, so that you can together and get to the finished product. And it's your job to figure out how to interpret their feedback the best possible way in order to come up with the best possible version of the music, and revise and do all that until it's done. So it sounds very basic, but the challenge of it can be that very often the literal words they use as their feedback don't necessarily correspond to what they actually want. You might say things like, this music is far too happy. It needs to be darker. It needs to be heavier. And so if you just start going and making it, darker by making it, say, scarier or something, you might be completely misinterpreting it. It turns out that maybe they just want it to be slower. That's all that they actually want, but they don't realize that that's what they want. It's not that they don't know how to say that. It's just that they haven't kind of psychologically analyzed themselves to realize what they're asking for. And I don't blame them, especially, movies and video games, it's really hard to be the director on a project like that. You got a million departments you have to look over and decisions you have to make every 2 seconds, and you're constantly wondering if you're making the right decision or wrong decision. And so they have to go with their instincts, and so it can be really difficult, especially if you're against the clock and having to go fast, to know if you're even making the right choice. And so coming up with the right vocabulary and giving feedback to a composer, it's not surprising that can kind of go wrong so easily, but it happens all the time. So my job is to figure out, what do they really mean? Regardless of what they are saying, what do they actually really mean? And sometimes they are very clear and they mean it exactly. They mean exactly what they're saying. But then other times, there's a bit of a detective work to do, if that makes sense.
It does, absolutely. Do you feel that in today's world, ideas get shut down even faster than, let's say, 10 years ago, also due to the change of the business?
In my mind, there hasn't really been any change there. Some directors give lots of feedback, some give almost no feedback. So it's just kind of varies project by project and job by job, and sometimes even cue by cue. I mean, I'll have some scores where it's just smooth sailing and easy and joyous, and then there's one cue that's just this huge pain and we can't figure it out. And then there's others where, every single cue is seemingly just a nightmare. It's really hard to generalize.
Austin, now I would love to dive right into Erica, one of your latest projects, the video game score, PlayStation 4 video game. I haven't played the game yet, but I listened to the album 3 times by now. And could you please could you please tell our audience more about the game and the concept behind it?
In general terms, the game is it's a thriller. Girl named Erica who had this traumatic childhood where she discovered the murdered body of her father as a little girl, and the case was never solved. And so now, in the present day, a new murder has occurred, and the police think maybe this is the same killer as the person we never caught who killed your father. And so she gets kind of pulled into this murder mystery, but then very quickly it starts to become more kind of paranoid, almost conspiracy theory type thriller. And the thing that's extremely unique about it for a video game is that it's shot entirely as a movie. It's what we refer to as a full motion video game, FMV, which means that there's no traditional video game animation and graphics and things like that. It's literally footage of actors on sets with costumes and props and lighting design and all the things that make movies movies. And so that obviously brought a lot of technical challenges with it for everyone involved, including the music. But it also was just, a great thriller bordering on horror that as a composer, is always just delightful to work on. Very kind of juicy with lots of emotion.
Did the creators of this game send you an idea first, or did they send you some footage first, which you then scored, or did they pitch you an idea and you delivered some cues based on that?
It was a lot of back and forth. So they hired me before they even finished the script. So I was able to kind of brainstorm ideas based around just the general notion of the kind of story they were looking to tell. Then they made a little prototype where they just filmed a couple of scenes so that they could, make sure that the technology was working of their, like their camera controls and all the different things they were experimenting with, and just making sure all that was going to work right. So I did some initial kind of prototype music way back in, I think, 2017. And then they shot the whole production like a movie shoot back in a summer or so of 2018, and I was able to visit the set in London and then very quickly started writing the music and spent maybe about 8 or 9 months scoring it. Similar way to how you would score a movie. They would send me the footage. Initially, I would just get little glimpses of footage, and I started writing music, knowing that everything was changing. They were continuing to edit and make improvements, and they even did some reshoots and things like that. But then also, I had this test kit from Sony, and I was able to write. I was able to play the game, send more music, download a new copy of the game, play it with my music now in the game, give feedback, make changes, and go forth and back and forth like that for 6 months straight or something like that, which is how I like to score every game. I like to be able to actually play it and then see how it feels in context. To me, that's really, really important, because just writing music and kind of emailing it to them and saying, okay, here it goes, I hope it works. To me, that's not how to score a game. That's not, just doesn't make sense. And you would never have any idea if it actually is doing everything that you're hoping it's doing. If it's good or if it's bad, or if it's too much of this or too much of that. It's just you're flying completely blind, and that to me is not okay.
But on a game, you generally have more time than, or as opposed to scoring a movie, because movies are usually scored in, let's say, well, it depends on the movie, 2 months, 2 months, maybe 4 months. A video game needs more preparation, and they are created, let's say, within 2 years or 3 years. Do you usually have a window of 6 months or even 1 year?
Oh yeah, at least. I very often have more than that. The longest I've ever had was 3 to 4 years, literally on a single game. But 1 to 2 years is pretty normal. 6 months tends to be on the shorter side. Movies, you're correct, tend to be anywhere from 3 to 4 weeks up to 2 months or 2 months, and that's all pretty typical. So, but it's not because games take longer to make. Actually, it's about the same, depending on the kind of game. Some movies, they take several years to make, and particularly if you include the process of the screenwriter developing the initial script. That's a multi-year process very often. The difference is that as a composer, there's, you really are footage in a movie, and there is no footage until the very end, because, they have to write it, they have to get a director, they have to cast it, they have to develop their props and costumes, and they have to choose their locations, they then have to shoot it, and they then have to edit, and only once the editing has begun is there usually something for a composer to start working with. Now, of course, there's many exceptions to this workflow. Very famously, Ennio Morricone and Sergio Leone would write music based entirely on the script, and Leone would play that music back while shooting. But that's not very typical. Normally, it's much more last second, because you need to have the actual footage to work with. But games, on the other hand, they don't divide up into those chapters. There is something to be working with a lot earlier, and then it just makes these incremental improvements. So I think it's the fact that we have more time is just because games are made a little bit differently, and it's easier for us to join the team sooner than in movies. Because if I join a movie while they're casting, there's nothing for me to do in general. Like I said, there's exceptions. So yes, and those long schedules to me are a blessing. I absolutely love being able to work on something for a year or two.
Could you tell me a bit about the theme development on Erica and how you came up with the themes and also the female voice, which you incorporated also in Aria for Delphi?
Sure, yeah. So it's kind of two main themes, because there's a theme for Erica, which is, she's very much the protagonist. The story always follows her perspective. We never cut away to other people at any point. We were always with her. And so there needed to be a theme that kind of tracks her narrative arc and her vulnerability, her strength, and how she kind of navigates through this scary situation. And that, Jack, the director, and we went through a lot of themes. There was a good solid year of me trying themes and writing melody after melody after melody before we both kind of felt like, yep, that's it. That's the one. And, but on the other hand, the second melody, which you're correct, it's the aria for Delphi, that's a source cue. We knew very early from the script that there would be like a vinyl record in the game that she puts on and listens to. And so we needed a kind of 50s pop song, or like a doo-wop to play, and the lyrics were told to me as coming from the Delphic maxims in Greek, and these classic words of wisdom that we know and remember still to this day, like "to thine own self be true," and that sort of thing. They stem from these Delphic maxims, almost in a way, almost like the Ten Commandments of ancient Greece. And there's a lot of them, though. And so they wanted the lyrics to be in Greek from those words. And so I wrote a melody, and they needed to be able to play it back on set while they were shooting, because it actually shows up in the game, being not only on the record player. So there's a scene at the piano where one of the characters is actually trying to play it for Erica. And so I had to write that quite quickly. That was one of those that, whereas I spent a year developing the main theme, I probably spent about an hour writing the aria for Delphi. And it just seemed to work, and we were, like, okay, well, let's just keep going. And then the funny thing that happened was I was writing the score, and I want to say maybe 6 months in, it dawned on me that I should really be using that aria for Delphi as an actual second theme. Originally, it was just a source cue, but then I started stripping out the vocals from it and threading them into the cues, and quite liking it. And then I went back and rewrote half the score to make it an actual second theme, where the main theme presents Erica as she is now, and the aria is sort of this reminder of her past, and particularly the horrors and the awfulness in her past.
I'm looking forward to playing the game, and I hope our audience enjoys it too. And I also hope they enjoy the album, which I certainly did. Like I mentioned, I listened to it a couple of times already. I think you did a wonderful job creating the music and writing the themes and the whole score. And is there anything else on your mind which you would like to share with me and the audience about Erica and your approach to it?
No, honestly, I felt like we were able to kind of hit the highlights, and I'm grateful that that you listened to it and that checks it out. If you go to my YouTube channel, which is just literally youtube.com/awintory, same handle I use for everything. If you go there, I've been posting some behind the scenes material, and if folks want to check that out, they might think that's cool. But otherwise, yeah, I feel like we covered it.
I would like to thank you for taking so much time out of your busy schedule. Thank you very much, and I wish you all the best for your future projects, and thanks again, and I hope you have a nice day.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you. Take care. I'll definitely be in touch.
Okay, goodbye, Austin. Bye-bye.